Bill Wood lives in California. He is a highly qualified scientist with degrees in mathematics, physics and chemistry. He's been granted high security clearance for a number of top-secret US government projects. Wood has worked with many major contractors to the United States government, including McDonnell Douglas, and also with engineers employed on the Saturn V, the Apollo launch vehicle. For many years, Bill Wood has harbored suspicions regarding the authenticity of the Apollo record.
I think that a lot of the people that I have had contact with in the aerospace industry want desperately to believe that this actually happened, because it's a source of pride that their profession contributed to an achievement like this. And then, of course, within the United States, we're all very proud that our country made this achievement. So there's a real reluctance to question anything that would destroy this lofty self-image. And particularly for the people who worked on the Apollo program, to many of them this was the most wonderful achievement that they ever produced during their entire life. And they would much rather think of it that way than to think that, like millions of other people, they were fooled into thinking they were working on something that was not genuine.
With aluminium shielding, it's accepted that the minimum requirement is a thickness of 10 centimeters all around the craft. Was there any attempt to provide such protection?
No. The walls of the craft were made as thin and light as possible. The Apollo capsule itself was made unusually thin. In fact, they couldn't even initially carry enough air inside to be the equivalent to sea level air pressure. They ran it at reduced pressure in order to be able to make the walls thinner. And then the LEM and other parts of the craft were all made out of very thin material, very flimsy. Almost no protection at all against solar radiation.
So why not try using a solid shield to protect the astronauts from these dangers?
Well, they didn't know how to put a shield like you suggest and still be able to make the weight capability of the Saturn V and carry everything to the moon. I believe that Wernher von Braun's team was basically assigned the task of designing a rocket that theoretically could take men to the moon if everything worked and if there were no substantial solar radiation. But the kind of rocket that they would have had to have in order to take people to the moon, taking into account solar radiation, would have been a much more massive vehicle, and they just decided that this was not something that they needed to deal with. They would just tell everybody that the radiation was okay.
The Americans also adopted a four-legged lander, but finally agreed upon an angular, tent-like craft. Basically, this was an arrangement of two engines stacked one on top of the other, with additional functions assigned to the angular spaces of the vehicle. The lower half of this ungainly but appealing craft contained the descent engine, and after the moonwalks this would become the launch pad for the upper part that contained the ascent engine. The pressurized crew cabin was arranged around the ascent engine housing, and the fuel tanks and equipment storage were located around that.
The LEM proposal was amazingly short. This was a 110-page document where Grumman proposed the entire LEM program, which is a $6.9 billion program. And that's an outrageously small document for anyone to submit and ask for $6.9 billion. There's no way that a reviewer could determine whether or not the contractor is going to accomplish anything worthwhile based on 110 pages of documentation for that size program. When I checked into 10 other programs of similar size, like the C-5A and large submarine orders or aircraft carrier orders, this type of thing, all of the proposals were between 5,000 pages and 86,000 pages, with an average of 38,000 pages. And yet we see this one standing there all by itself at 110 pages. And it appeared to me that this may have been a situation where they knew that if anyone checked, someone would say, well, in order to win this, you had to submit a proposal, right? So let me see the proposal. So they had to produce a proposal, but they didn't go to the trouble of producing one of decent length. A 110-page proposal is about appropriate for a $1.4 million program, which is 5,000 times smaller than the claimed LEM program. Now, you wouldn't need a very long proposal if you weren't really going to build a LEM that really had to work. If you were going to be building LEMs that ended up in museums or on displays, then you could probably do that for a few $1,000,000, and that might only require a 110-page proposal. The claim is that the Apollo program collected hundreds of pounds of lunar rocks, something like 750 pounds, some large amount of lunar rocks in the 6 missions. And I think that only a few pounds were actually collected remotely by ourselves and in a similar manner by the Russians, because we had an agreement before we went to the moon to trade lunar soil samples. We would trade soil from the sites that we visited, and they would trade samples from the sites that their robot craft visited and compare them. One craft could have performed all of the functions that would simulate the lunar lander. It could land on the moon with its repeater, and this craft could also place a transmitting seismometer into the lunar soil that could continue to transmit back lunar quakes, which we received for quite some time. This same device could also pop out a laser reflector onto the moon's surface, and it could perform all of these functions. It could also have lowered a drill into the lunar soil and dug up lunar soil, and then the return craft, unmanned, could bring that soil back to Earth.